right, so now we've gotten through all the sensory channels and how they function and how they interact. And then we've also gotten through regulation and how a child registers that sensory input. Now we're going to get to the fun part. Now we get to the part of the actual intervention, or what you can do to help your child with these sensory issues and really help any child, because sensory is the vehicle that they use to learn and function and regulate their behavior and understand their environment. So what I'm going to do is, first, I want you to understand that sensory is in everything that you do. And so for a child, you want to understand that every aspect of their functioning, they're using their sensory systems. And so you want to, just like I had talked about in the registration video, you want to be thinking of those as little opportunities. And so if one opportunity doesn't go very well, you just move on to the next one, and you know how to adjust those opportunities because you understand their sensory systems better. And one example I like to give is, let's say you asked your spouse or your mom a question and they didn't hear you, they didn't respond to it. Well, you would make those modifications. You might move a little bit closer to them, you might wait until they have eye contact with you, you might change or rephrase the question. And so that's what you want to be thinking about with these little ones when you're working with them. If one snapshot or interaction is not effective, then you are going to want to make those subtle modifications so you can maximize those opportunities, because the more opportunity they have to learn and really respond effectively to input, the better they're going to feel, the better they're going to function. Okay, so the easiest way to do this is to go kind of channel by channel. I'm going to talk about intervention that you can use to help stimulate each channel, and then at the end we're also going to talk about how those channels interact with each other, and why it's so important to really be stimulating certain channels, and if certain channels are too overwhelming for children, how you can kind of reduce the stimulation so that the other channels are functioning better. Okay, so why don't we start with the oral sensory channel? That's their mouth. That is the most highly sensitive channel. It's the first one to come in, as we talked about, and so it's very effective, one, in the child getting lots of input. It is the most highly developed at birth because they need it to feed. And that's why when you see your little cuties putting lots of things in their mouths, like non-food items, it's indicative that that channel needs more input. Another thing that's great about that channel is that it is highly responsive to input in terms of getting information and understanding it. That's why they're putting things in their mouth in typical development around 7 months of age. It's because their vision isn't great, their motor skills aren't great to give them information, so they're using their mouth to understand aspects, physical aspects of items. And then once their other channels get more effective, that fades away. But for little cuties with sensory issues, they go back to that channel over and over and over again. Another thing about that channel is highly calming. That's where kiddos are sucking their thumb or using a pacifier, or why people smoke and chew gum and do all those kinds of things. It's because if you use that channel effectively, it has a great ability to calm the nervous system. One thing you need to remember with kiddos is that they often will have lots of food sensitivities in this area. And so that is something, and I'm going to talk about this over and over again in all the channels, is when a child has a strong aversion to sensory input, the tendency is to avoid it. And what you really want to be doing is systematically introducing that input within their tolerance. Because just like any of us, if you have challenging aspects to your functioning, if you avoid them, that is not going to improve. You have to be able to gradually work through those things. And that doesn't mean that they're going to become an amazing eater, but it does mean that you are going to expand their repertoire of food preferences. And so what you're going to want to do in terms of intervention is if you have a child who has a lot of food aversions, this is probably the biggest challenge for parents, is you're going to want to get involved, one, with a speech pathologist, with an occupational therapist, and work on some oral motor exercises and sensory strategies. What you can do at home is, again, kind of systematically try to introduce things. And you're really going to push because the child will not like that. As you know, they're not going to be happy about that. But what you're going to do is, let's say if you want them to go from a sippy cup to drinking from a straw or drinking from a cup, you are going to really fade that sippy cup away and be introducing that on a regular basis, because they can do that. They just know that they have this other option and they will lean towards that other option. Another thing you're going to want to remember is that if you're introducing new foods, things like that, make sure they're in a good place for that. So if they're overwhelmed, you don't, when I say push, I don't mean that you're really going to be all over them to try this. What I'm saying is that you are very consistently presenting that opportunity to them, like every mealtime. You would present a new food, just one, have them touch it, they're going to smell it, they're going to start acclimating and sensitizing to those aspects. It's okay if they don't taste it at first, but you want to give them those opportunities to experience it and sensitize to it. Then you can introduce the food that they do enjoy. You will see then this gradually improve. Same thing. Another thing that's important with the oral sensory is it's highly calming, highly organizing, and they need that oral input not just for nutrition, but for their motor aspects, their oral motor to develop. That's what food does. It teaches you about textures. It teaches you how to move the muscles in your mouth, how to chew. It gives lots of input to the jaw and things. And so that is necessary for their oral motor structures to develop, so then their speech sounds can improve. And so that's why it's really important, obviously from a nutritional standpoint, but also from an oral motor standpoint. You want that to get better. You want to really focus on exposing them. I think a lot of times parents just think, oh, they're really picky, and that's okay. And they're concerned about it from a nutrition standpoint, but they aren't understanding that that is also then going to impact the way the mouth moves. So for example, I eat an ice cream cone very differently than I chew a chocolate chip cookie, or then I drink from a bottle of water. And so that's where, when I talk about really maximizing these opportunities, you want a good variety of experiences for the child to benefit from. Now, in terms of other intervention, the great thing about the mouth and oral sensory input is it is highly organizing and highly calming. So you can use those strategies for children to help them with activities. And that's why when you see a little one who's maybe cutting, they're stabilizing with their mouth. You see their little tongue come out, or you see them posture with their mouth, they might bite their lip. And that's because there's just tons of stability that they get from their mouth. And so when you're working on a very challenging task with them, use stability from the mouth for them. So you may want to give them intermittently pretzels, anything that's crunchy. So in other words, they are coloring, and then you give them a pretzel. And then they do a quick puzzle, and you give them a Skittle. You will see, because that really stimulates the brainstem and all of that, that's really going to help them function through an activity. A lot of times people will say, well, I don't want that to be a reward, or I don't want them to just know that they're going to get candy, but shake it up. You know that this is really a great sensory channel that you can use to help stimulate that nervous system so that other aspects of the nervous system and sensory systems function better. And so a lot of times when they're losing attention, for example, give them something sour. A quick spray, Warheads makes this great spray that if you give them a quick spray, that actually kind of reboots their brainstem and helps them focus for a brief period of time. And it helps kick in, if you think of any of us, something sour, sip of lemonade, things like that, that really like perks you up for a second. So that then can help you really get through a brief period of functioning. Okay, so that's the oral sensory one. Let's go to auditory. From an auditory standpoint, that's everything the child is hearing. And this is important, just like I talked about, in terms of them processing things in their environment, the sounds that they make and stimulation. And that really deals with all sorts of aspects, from volume to background noise, to processing it and registering it, and also discriminating in terms of what is relevant information for them and what's irrelevant. So one thing you want to remember is that be very mindful of the auditory stimulation in an environment. In a classroom, in a preschool, in your home environment, there is a lot of background noise, and these kiddos don't process language well. So that, rather than being organizing for the brain, becomes incredibly distracting and frustrating. It's just like any of us. If you're, around a freight train or, a jackhammer, after a little while, you're like, I can't even think straight. This is just so overwhelming. But that's how these kiddos process that information. For us, it is not overwhelming, but for them, it's so they just over-register that. And so one thing that I notice is in our attempt to encourage them and help them and guide them, we are constantly overwhelming them with auditory stimulation. You're saying, good job, do it this way. No, let's try it this way. The most effective thing that I have had during my treatments is to just be silent, is to verbally eliminate this excess noise. It's to give them minimal verbal prompting. So if you want them to do a puzzle, sit behind them and show them a few pieces and then prompt them to do it. If you want them, again, during, let's say we'll go back to just trying things at the dinner table, present it to them and let them just experience it without you giving them a lot of language. You need to try this, you need to, really use a simple strategy, minimal prompts. First broccoli, then crackers, as a simple example. Another thing too is be mindful of just lots of information in the environment. So if you are wanting to work with them on a particular activity, the TV is off, things are, be mindful of a lot of activity in the environment, other children, all of that can be difficult for them to process. So that's the auditory channel. Another thing too is with the auditory channel, they often do not process or register some of the input because of those distractions. And that's why when you're calling their name or when you're using language, they simply just aren't registering it. It's too overwhelming. They're not able to differentiate. And so that's why just calling it over and over and over again, or adding a lot of language, use picture schedules, use other prompts, and they'll get the idea. And then once those sensory systems process better auditorily, they will be able to tolerate a much greater volume of input. And so just give them a little bit more time to develop in that area. All right, so vision, we'll talk about that next. So ocular motor functioning, and that looks at not the acuity. Acuity is how well you see. Actually looks at how the eyes process and register information in their environment. Obviously incredibly stimulating. There is so much going on visually in your environment, and you need to be mindful of that because a couple reasons. One is sensory kiddos are oversensitive to many visual stimuli, even something as simple as light. And we all know on a sunny day that's going to be overwhelming, but even just basic room lighting is a significant factor for them. So you are going to want to watch the lighting. A lot of classrooms, even in homes, there's a lot of bright lighting, so really bring that down so they're able to see the task, but there isn't so much exposure to these bright lights. Because actually dimmed lighting also helps calm the nervous system. So when kids are overwhelmed, just by naturally turning off the lights, that is a cue for the nervous system to kind of calm down and regroup. Another thing with kiddos is that is why they will look away and they have minimal eye contact, is they just can't tolerate the volume of visual stimulation in their environment. And so when you're presenting an activity, really limit it. A lot of things, it seems so simple, but if you have an assignment, block off most of it, except for the one portion that you're looking at. Some of these kiddos too, because they are seeing things, but the brain is not registering what they're seeing, that's why they do a lot of stimming. And so when you'll see them kind of look to the side, or they will spin something, it's because it's so highly stimulating. It really feeds the brain. And the brain then is just enjoying that input, but it's not a functional skill for them. And so while stimming in and of itself is absolutely okay, and they're going to do it, but you want to reduce that and replace it with a more functional adaptive behavior. So when you're seeing a lot of stimming that way, the nervous system is indicating that it needs more input. And so it's using a channel that's effective for it, that visual channel. But you can reduce that by engaging them in a motor activity, or giving them deep pressure, or giving them, jumping on the trampoline, going outside to swing. And that is going to replace it with a much more functional type of input. Okay, so in terms of movement, so let's talk about the vestibular system. So the vestibular system is your movement sense, and that's how the child processes and understands movement. And so what you want to do with this channel is you want to be using it very, very consistently. The one, I think, change that we have seen in recent years is that children move so much less than they used to, 50 years ago, let's say, or 30 years ago. And so what that does is the nervous system, for it to develop and for it to be strengthened, needs a steady diet of movement. And if it's not getting enough of that, it is going to seek stimulation in all these maladaptive ways. It's going to seek it through stimming, like we talked about, vision. It's going to, the flapping and things. That's because the nervous system is craving that input. It needs a huge volume of it to be satiated. And a lot of times, just in modern society, all of our activities are so sedentary. It's the iPad, it's all sorts of curriculum, it's reading, television, things that just were not available to children, 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And for the muscles to strengthen and for the nervous system to really process and be strong, you really need a huge volume of input and simple input. Swinging, running, playing, climbing, all of that is what is creating this huge amount of activity and stimulation for the nervous system to process. And so as hard as it is, you want to be providing those opportunities. And it is as simple as when they're first up in the morning, they're outside swinging, running, jumping, playing, unstructured play. But that is really giving that nutrition to the nervous system and helping those movement channels understand movement and get the amount of movement that they need. From there then, that's when you would come in and do a more sedentary activity, because then the nervous system is more prepared for it to function. It's kind of like going for a run. You have to stretch first, you have to have the equipment on, you need the right shoes, you need your iPad, and then you're ready to go. If you don't have that on a very regular basis, obviously you're going to see that in your body. You're going to see that in terms of your overall fitness, your overall wellness, and you want to think of that for children as well. So get them out and playing, or activity. If you can't go outside, it's still, let's jump on the trampoline, let's do all sorts of things. Try to have maybe a crash pad at your house. On Pinterest, they have great ideas for crash pads that you can make for home use. Things like that, but you're really going to want to focus heavily on activity and unstructured activity. All right, the next channel we're going to talk about is proprioception, and that is your position sense. That is how your brain knows how to position your body in response to the vestibular or the movement centers. And so with proprioception, that is important because it really helps understand how to reposition the body in relation to movement. Another thing that's great about the proprioceptors are they are located in your joints and muscle bellies, and they respond to heavy, heavy pounding, input, strength, all of those kinds of things. And that's why children are really doing a lot of crashing and all sorts of, a lot of kids will ask, they'll kind of have you push your hand on their chin, or they want you to give them deep pressure, all of those type things. And so what you want to do is really use those proprioceptors, and when you're jumping on the trampoline, that's heavy input to those proprioceptors. When you're giving the child deep pressure, another thing is, let's say with their hands, you have to remember there are proprioceptors in your hands, there are proprioceptors in your jaw. So if you're doing a fine motor activity, which is challenging for kiddos, you want to draw the attention to that activity and the nervous system's attention to the hands themselves. So you may want to give them really heavy input. You can put their little hand between yours, make sure the little fingers are straight, and really push as hard as you can. Then you can do that with the other hand. Push as hard as you can. Then have them do the puzzle. Same thing, back to the oral motor that we talk about. If you give them a piece of gum or a piece of really chewy hard candy, that also is highly calming, and that's because it's the proprioceptors processing that. But that is going to help in terms of the nervous system getting that input. It's going to automatically calm. The proprioceptors always calm. That's why hugging and deep pressure has a calming effect on the nervous system. Movement and activity has a stimulating effect on the nervous system. So really focus on that. Another thing too is when you're trying to, let's say, play catch or do a different activity and they're really not focused on it, have them clap their hands or something that gives that input. You're getting a lot of proprioceptive input to that. Or doing that wrestling, that heavy play, and heavy work is incredibly effective at really strengthening the proprioceptors. And that's another thing that in modern day just development, children are not as exposed to. And that is, the heavy work of being out in the yard, carrying, lifting, scrubbing, helping with laundry, just a lot of activities that kids don't engage in as much anymore. Climbing those trees, doing all those things really, really challenges the proprioceptors. The more they're challenged, obviously the stronger they are. So if the child doesn't have as many opportunities for that, that's again where the nervous system is just trying to get any kind of input it can, and just because it's not enough. So you want to get them out there, have them pull a sibling in the wagon, have them lift heavy things, have them help you as best they can, do all of those opportunities. Even things like swimming are great for that, a tumbling class is great for that, but the more opportunity they have to push, pull, carry, lift, climb, all of that, that really helps strengthen those receptors, and those receptors then will do their own job of helping with the child's overall functioning, and they absolutely will feel better. So any opportunity you can have to go to like a jump, like play on a jumpy, go on the trampoline, climb on the slide. A lot of times kids are climbing up the slide. That's very effective. At times they can't do that, but that's typical in development for them to do that because the proprioceptors love that climbing piece. So if they're climbing up the slide, that's perfectly fine as long as it's not a danger to them, or as long as it's just not allowed because it's in a school setting or preschool setting where other children are, waiting to slide down. But that's why they do that, is every child climbs up the slide because they're just naturally climbers. They're natural little wrestlers. So try to pocket that in as much as you can. The more you do that, the better they build strength, the better stability they have, the better they're able to process their position sense of their body and process movement opportunities. All right, tactile. We're going to go through that next. All right, from a tactile standpoint, this is something that, again, many children are very sensitive to, different textures and things. And what you want to do is to really be systematically introducing those textures, and it can be and also mindful of those textures, and not just textures but temperatures in the environment. All of those type things can actually be incredibly distracting for the child, and so what you want to do though is really provide opportunities for them to get tactile exposure. And so if they don't like glue on their hands, start with just the teensiest little bit. It's a misperception of sensory input. It's they're oversensitive to it and they perceive it as harmful as opposed to, and it's uncomfortable, but it's simply because they have not been exposed to it enough for the brain to register it as a benign input. And so a lot of times parents will really pull away from that and not expose them and say, oh, they don't like to wear that. But you want them to do that, but make it more comfortable for them. If the tag bothers them, what's great now is there are so many tagless shirts available. If they don't like jeans, that's fine. Put them in different pants and things. But other opportunities for input, you're going to want to gently expose them and sensitize them to that. So in other words, if they just can't tolerate rice, just gradually maybe put it in your hand and help them just touch it. Make sure they're not overwhelmed by it, because if they're overwhelmed, that opportunity is already lost. You have to wait for a different opportunity. But I've had lots of kiddos that are sensitive at first, and just with more exposure, you can absolutely get them past that. That being said, they very often are going to continue to be more sensitive than your typical child, but that's okay. That's why we all have personalities and different preferences in life, because we all are unique. You just want them to have a repertoire that's large enough that they can function through it. And so with the tactile, like I said, you just want to systematically be introducing more and more fun textures, and the more they experience it, what's nice is 90% of the time that will snowball and it just doesn't become an issue anymore. It just is very often something that initially when they're teeny, around 2 or 3, they are very fearful of. And then as you introduce it, they become more and more acclimated to it. Another thing too is you want to stay calm in those situations, be quiet in those situations, and just present it. So if they're sit them at the table when you're doing your work, and then just gently put a little rice in your hand or put a little shaving cream in your hand and let them just process it. You don't even have to tell them anything. Just sit it there, and 99% of the time, they are going to approach it themselves. They're going to explore it and process it in more and more volume of that, and they're going to start to expand their own repertoire in terms of their tactile processing. Just be mindful though of things like temperature in the room and things that are uncomfortable. So if they are very uncomfortable with certain things, again, systematically introduce it, but don't overwhelm them with it. Because for any of us, if you're freezing, you are not able to function in that setting. Picture being outside when it's 30 below and you are just so uncomfortable. Not a lot of learning is going to go on at that time. So I'm not saying that the child is experiencing it to that degree, but they are very uncomfortable, and that discomfort is going to impact their functioning. It's going to impact their behavior. So what you want to do is make it more comfortable for them, and then they will function better. But also be mindful of reducing that stimulation. So very subtly introduce tactile input. All right, from an olfactory standpoint or a smell standpoint, this one is very tricky in terms of parents will say, oh gosh, there are certain smells that are just such aversions to them. And that really is just because they're at such a heightened state of arousal. And that's just because their sensory systems are overly sensitive. And so they all interact with each other. And when they experience certain smells that for us are benign, for them it's just overwhelming. Now, that usually does fade over time and usually just becomes a few smells here and there. And all that you're noticing with that in terms of smell aversions is it's an indicator that the child has sensory processing difficulties, because most of us can tolerate smells and you might say, ooh, that does not smell good, but it's not uncomfortable. Where you have some of these kiddos that they really just cannot tolerate it. That will get better over time as the sensory systems desensitize and start functioning better, because when they function better, when they're stronger, the overall system processes input better. And rather than processing it as noxious, they'll just process it like we do and just say, oh, I don't really care for the smell of that cheese or whatever that is. Okay, so now I want to talk about how everything interacts. And what you need to remember is that for a child to develop any skill, social skills, language skills, academic skills, all of it, motor skills, they have to process sensory input for those skills to develop. That is how they interpret what's going on in their environment. That's how they motor plan and figure out their response to that. That is how they remediate or make adjustments to their functioning. So if those sensory systems are not functioning well, the child's functioning is completely clouded. It's kind of like they're underwater a little bit. Everything is a little bit distorted. So when you're talking about sensory input, you're really helping stimulate the nervous system so that it's stronger and functions better. And it will build upon itself. But I think a lot of times with sensory, people think, oh yeah, it's a sensory issue, or I have a rice box at home. We do sensory activities. We do shaving cream. But what you need to remember is every aspect of their functioning is sensory input, and you want to have a good understanding of that so that they can process that better. Because when their sensory systems or their foundational development improves, it is a much stronger base for other skill to build upon. They're going to have much better perception of that skill. They're going to have much better ability to remediate, refine that skill, and understand that skill. And they are going to feel better. These kiddos do not feel well a lot of the time just because their whole nervous system is not functioning well. And so the better it functions, the more effective it is, the stronger it is, the better they're going to be able to use it as their resource. Another example, when you look at how all these sensory systems integrate and impact the child's functioning, we're going to use a ball example, okay? So if you're playing ball with a child, the first thing that you're going to do is call their name. So auditorily, they're going to respond to that. There's something, even if they're not responding to their name specifically, they hear something and the natural response is you respond and look in that direction. Visually, obviously, they're going to cast their gaze that way to the direction of the voice. Ocular motor wise, their eyes from a motor standpoint really focus on what is that stimulation. So then, as the ball comes towards them, they're visually perceiving that. The proprioceptors and the movement centers then have to kick in. So, for example, when the ball is coming towards them, the movement center is stimulating them from a kinesthesia standpoint to move and get there. The proprioceptors make sure that you're in the right position. Because if they're over here and the ball is here, boop, that's not going to be effective. And so that's where you can see all these sensory systems coming into play. Another thing too, the feel of the ball. When the ball comes in, they need to know to grab it and how that feels. That's where the tactile centers come in. Because if you think about having gloves on, if that input isn't really effective, then obviously your grasp, your motor is not, it's a little bit cloudy, a little bit distorted. But same thing with head writing, all of these things come into play, and such a simple thing as catching a ball, things we take for granted every day. And everything that they do, from brushing their teeth to drinking water to holding their head up to playing with an iPad to coloring, all of that requires these sensory systems. You have to know how to hold it. You have to feel if it's not quite right. I make adjustments. It's just like any of us. If you picked up a pencil with your non-dominant hand, you quickly would know, whoops, this isn't right, and switch. Same thing if you're not holding it the way you always do, right away your sensory systems are going to let you know, whoop, this isn't quite right, and you make those adjustments. That's where you see with these little cuties, they have a hard time doing that because their sensory systems are not functioning as efficiently as they should, so they have a hard time making those modifications. But the stronger the sensory systems get, the more opportunity they have to strengthen, then you'll see that refinement start to unfold. I hope you found the video helpful. I hope it gave you better insight into how sensory processing works and how it is a crucial foundation to your child's development and functioning. If you suspect that your child has sensory processing difficulties, or if you know they do, you're going to want to work with an occupational therapist. They are uniquely qualified to help develop a plan of treatment for your child and to help guide you in further developing and working with your child so that they function better. Thank you so much for your time. I want to encourage you to go to the Sensory Explained website, because there are links to our Facebook page, there are resources like newsletters, Pinterest pins, and those are just additional resources for you to use with your kiddo.